So in today's video, we're going to touch on how to cover a guinea pig cage with hardware cloth. And I did want to mention my camera decided to die some point through this video. I am not exactly positive at what point because I'm filming this before I've actually looked at the footage, because I also managed to kill it so much that I couldn't turn it back on to check. So hopefully there's enough footage here that you can get some use out of it. I will now get right into the actual process and the voiceover. So the first thing I did was I clipped all the little pointy edges off of this piece of hardware cloth. And then the next thing that I did was line it up to the bottom left corner of the smallest side of the cage, because this was the side I chose to work on first. Then what I did is cut up the cloth along the right side edge. Since this is a grid pattern, it's really easy to just cut in between the grid and make a nice squared shape. I also cut across shortly after that. Before attaching the piece that I just cut, I trimmed off any little sharp pointy edges so that it was nice and smooth and I wouldn't cut myself on the hardware cloth. And that gives you this nice panel piece that you can then zip tie onto the cage. And because this is a folding cage, meaning you can take the top off and undo the latches and then fold it flat for packing, I wanted to make sure I could maintain that aspect of it so that I could store it in my closet. So I left a small gap at all the places where the joints are in the bends of the wire, if that makes sense. Hopefully it'll make sense when you see this picture I'm showing you. So I'm trimming that up, making sure that there's space so that the flap can fold inward. You'll also notice that I notched out around each of these little latch mechanisms and the little hooks on the side of the cage as well. The next step is to remove this metal door latch, which you can see in this picture. I'm going to pull it at these little bent areas on both sides with a pair of pliers. You just need it open enough that you can remove the latch entirely. Next, I cut the panel for the door on the front of this cage, and I kept pinching myself with the handles of these clippers. I don't know if I'm holding them wrong or what, but I trimmed the door panel and then I cut off a little bit so that it would fit just a little better. It was slightly too long and slightly too tall. I also trimmed off all the little sharp pointy bits.
Good, that sits perfect. And that go once. I'm gonna use clear on that one.
The next thing I did was fasten 5 zip ties, 1 in each corner and 1 in the center front. And then after that was done, I cut all the little ends off with my clippers. So the next step was to lay out my mesh across the front of the cage and cut out a large rectangle from the hardware cloth. After this process, I trimmed up a lot of the sharp edges and made sure it was going to fit around the hinges on the top of the cage. I didn't want to interfere with that folding mechanism, like I said. And then I cut out the center where the door went. In hindsight, I should have saved that scrap and put it on the door, but I didn't throw it away, of course. I saved it for another day. And apparently that is where my camera decided to die, so I don't have any footage of me attaching this panel to the front of the cage or it cut out with the door hole removed. So I'm going to show you some pictures and video of the front of the cage so that hopefully you'll get an idea of what I did. So you'll see a slight gap between the front panel and the top panel because that folds over. We'll talk about that in a minute. You'll also see that there are notches cut out where the little hinges go, the latches. There's a gap, just a little one around the edge of the door. Lychee wanted to nibble my fingers. So that way the door can move. It's not big enough that I can even stick my whole finger in. It's just barely the tip of my finger, so they can't escape. The door panel got slightly off when I attached it, so there's a gap on one side and not on the other, but it doesn't interfere with the use of the door at all. I also wanted to point out that I did reattach that little latching mechanism that we took off earlier. I put it right through the hardware cloth and attached it to the top of the cage so that the door can latch properly. So I lost the whole video of me doing the back panel, but it's essentially the same as cutting out the front before I did the door, or like cutting out the side panels, honestly. It's just a long rectangle, I'm showing you that. And I zip tied it in several places along the sides and corners and back. Here's me opening the door so you can see that all 4 sides are covered in hardware cloth. All of the mechanisms work so far. Next, I wanted to just make sure that this fit on the plastic base, so I could just check that the bars hadn't become like too thick to fit properly. There's this small groove inside the top edge of the base that the bars have to sit in, and I wanted to make sure all of that worked correctly, that the latches could still latch and that it was secure also, that it wasn't going to like come apart after I put it in place. So this is me testing that. As you can see, it clearly works just fine. There were no issues. So next I decided to do the top. So this roll of hardware cloth was brand new and I needed it to stay in place as I went. So I was folding the one side over, and then I actually snipped little notches so that I could still fold the cage flat like I had wanted to collapse it. And you'll see me doing that. And then the next step, I actually zip tied it to the edge of the cage so that it wouldn't move, because it kept shifting as I was trying to unroll it. Since the roll was rolled tight, it was not flat. And you'll see that in the finished products. There's some wave to it. I did try to flatten it out, but it just didn't flatten very well. But that's okay. It still was solid enough that it kept the rats inside. I cut little notches so that the cage could fold on the short side opposite what I'd already done, trimmed down the front, and then I folded the front over and cleaned up all the little sharp pointy bits, zip tying as I went and making sure that everything was as flat as possible. The longest part of this whole project was actually trimming all the little tiny sharp edges off of the hardware cloth. This hardware cloth was actually really easy to work with because it has a coating on it that I thought would make it easier to clean, which I was correct on that, thank goodness. But it still is just tedious, and my wrist most definitely was sore the next couple of days. I actually had to put my carpal tunnel brace on for a little bit just to give it a chance to rest. So that is the hardest part of the project, but it's really not hard, it's just time consuming. I think this whole thing took me maybe 3 hours, and most of that was just trimming it and being really meticulous to make sure it fit properly on the existing cage. And then I left this part in here because it's very satisfying for me to watch, so I thought perhaps it would be for the rest of you. But the last step is, of course, to clean up the floor. You can see there's tons of little green coated hardware cloth shards on the floor, and my floor is carpet. So I brought out what my husband called baby sucks your face off, and we vacuumed up the carpet. And just, I find the carpet lines when you vacuum so satisfying. Baby sucks your face off got something on it, and I keep forgetting to clean it off, and at this point I just don't care that much. The vacuum gets stored when it's not in use, so we'll just overlook that. That's just life in our house. Some things are not priority, but getting the carpet cleaned was definitely a priority. So here's our finished product, starting from one of the short sides. You can see there is a small gap at the top, and there's space on the sides. Little notches cut out for each of these little hooks that hold the side together. I also cut out a section for these little latch mechanisms on each side. Same gap and hook notches are on this side. And then I'm showing you the space at the bottom as well so that it will sit flush with the bottom of the cage. There's a notch there for that hook at the top and on the corner. A small gap here and another notch, and that continues across. You can also see that the cage is not flat, but that's okay. This is across the front, and you can see all of those little notches, which are great. That allows that bending so the cage will fold flat like I was talking about. This continues along the back of the cage and the sides. You can see that the hardware cloth has notches along the top for each of those little loops as well. and that it folds over the top on the front and back. And then here's on the side view, so you can see the front panel. You can see that gap all the way around the front. More notches in the bottom corner, and that it doesn't touch the bottom base tray. And you can see close-ups of where I've positioned the different zip ties to hold everything in place. The latch mechanism works. It's squeaky, but it works without any issues. They can't open it. And here's some pictures of the finished product. Thanks for watching. Bye.